Carley McCord and James Haralson here for your post-game report for 104.5, 104.9 ESPN Radio, Baton Rouge. Following a victory, 21-19 win here in Starksville. Tigers walking away with the W, but it wasn't easy. James, what's your total takeaway? What's your general opinion on what happened out there tonight?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be an SEC home opener, I guess, for LSU, wouldn't it? Coming right down to the very last second. Carly, I think for me, the biggest thing that sticks out is penalties. And the Tigers, I had the final stats here. They had 9 penalties for 95 yards. And these aren't just, 9 random penalties. I mean, these came in very key, crucial moments when the Tigers actually could have scored. And we're talking about a much larger deficit here. I think that if you're an LSU fan, that's the one kind of concern that you have going away from it. And I just got back from Les Miles' press conference, and that's kind of the thing that he really harped on. In fact, he said, quote, "We have to do something about all these damn penalties," unquote. So that's going to be a huge emphasis for this team going into it. As far as the play calling goes, Les Miles at coaching for 11 years, Les Miles' strategy is to run the ball up the gut. You're not going to see a lot of air it out offense. You're going to see just enough passing to get by. I'm looking at the final stats here, and Leonard Fournette 28, 163 yards here. And that's going to be your bell cow. I mean, that's going to be what the Tigers really sort of emphasize going on the rest of the season here. They're going to really emphasize the run up the gut. And that's something that Les Miles reiterated in his press conference. He was also asked about whether or not he considered bringing Anthony Jennings in at any point. And he said, they just felt very confident with Brandon Harris, who I thought had a very good game tonight. But he did mention to us that he still likes Anthony Jennings. He wouldn't hesitate to bring him back in the game. So I think overall, there's not really a whole lot of surprises here. I think if you're a fan and you look in the fourth quarter and see them run up the gut 3 straight times, that's just the style of this team. And I thought Matt Moscona on Twitter really brought up a really good point. This is kind of the formula that worked for them in 2011. Basically running the ball up the gut, wearing down the teams late in the second half. But I think, Carly, the biggest takeaway for me, obviously, is the penalties. And, you're going into next week taking on an Auburn team that, took overtime today to beat a lowly opponent. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Tigers really emphasize in this week's practice as far as taking away those penalties.
James, you talked about the passing game with Brandon Harris. He only had 14 attempts, and some of those were mainly just bubbles. It was like right over 70 yards, I think that it was for. So, of course, you think that Brandon Harris did have a good game, but we also didn't really see enough to really get a general, full, good impression of what he is capable of. Do you think that has anything to do with Les Miles not trusting in his quarterback, or do you think he just trusted in his running game that much?
Well, I think he just trusts in his running game that much. I mean, again, I'll go back to the way that this team is built, and it's built on the run. I think as far as Brandon Harris goes with this game, I think obviously the coaching staff really wanted to get Brandon Harris comfortable. If you remember, the last time that he had a start on the road against an SEC team was Auburn, and that went terribly in 2014. I think the coaching staff really, in my opinion, had a good mix of really easing Harris into the games. Now, I thought sometimes they probably could have gone vertical a little bit more with the passing game. But I think that looking at tonight's game, you get out with a win. And I think one of the most important points is Brandon Harris has confidence. Didn't turn the ball over, had a pretty decent game, had a lot of great completions, not just completions, but some great runs as well. So I think if you're LSU, I think you've really accomplished what you wanted to accomplish with Brandon Harris in tonight's game.
And Brandon Harris does have confidence. That's one thing that we could see him exuding tonight. And we all know that he has such a great supporting cast around him and his receiving core. Do you think that's going to be utilized much this season, or do you think that we're just going to keep seeing more and more from the young running talent that we have here on the LSU team?
Well, I think that looking forward for the rest of the season, I think you're going to see a heavy emphasis on the run. I think that the run is always going to outnumber the passing numbers. I don't have the stats, the final stats of the cumulative rushing and passing, but passing was under 100, and it didn't even hold a candle to our rushing numbers. Well, I think you're going to see that, and I think you're going to see Williams get more involved in the rushing game as well to kind of spell Fournette. So I think that first and foremost, it's going to be built off the run. Now, with that said, I like what I saw tonight with the passing game. There was a few plays down there. Again, I go back to the few plays that they opened up the vertical passing game. We even got some tight ends involved tonight. So I think that there's definitely a shift, and it's a good shift. So I think if you're an LSU fan, you're definitely going to see the passing game emphasized, I think, more going down the road. But again, just keep in mind, this team is built on the run, and they're going to emphasize that. And that's just how it's built.
LSU faces Auburn at home in Tiger Stadium next week, and we all watched Auburn today. Oh, we almost witnessed an upset, but they ended up being able to pull it off against Jacksonville State. Great game. What are you expecting to see versus Auburn? What do you think that they're going to change and adjust, going into next week?
Well, it's funny because Auburn was probably one of the favorites to win the SEC in the preseason, and we've seen them through two games, and they're not stellar. And there's a lot of hype being placed on Jeremy Johnson, the quarterback for Auburn, and he really hasn't been stellar either. So it's very interesting. I think that LSU is still going to be challenged a little bit in terms of containing another mobile quarterback. They got some great practice tonight with Dak Prescott. Now you're going to handle another mobile quarterback with also one hell of an arm in Jeremy Johnson. It's going to be interesting. I mean, Carly, when I look at this team, I see a team that's really solid on the defensive side of the ball. And I had a lot of my question marks answered with that. So I'm not really concerned going into the Auburn game with that. Again, though, I go back to those penalties, and that's going to be the key thing. Now, I like that it's in Tiger Stadium, and I like that it's in front of a home crowd, but I think that that's going to be your X factor. And if you have penalties like you had tonight where you miss scoring opportunities and you take points off the board because of penalties, Auburn, I think, is a much more talented team than Mississippi State, and I think that they could really kind of take advantage of that. So the Tigers are going to have to be careful. I think it's going to be a tougher test than you had tonight in Starkville, but after the first 2 weeks, I'm not as high on Auburn as I once was. And, if you followed me on my podcast, on Twitter, social media.
You were very high on them.
I was very high on Auburn, and I had LSU losing to Auburn. So it'll be interesting. I've kind of lost a little bit of my love for Auburn here in these last 2 weeks. And I wouldn't be surprised if LSU comes away. But again, it comes down to penalties.
Once again, LSU had a win tonight, but it wasn't easy here in Starkville, Mississippi. It did get a little bit chilly. Do you think the weather had any effect in the time? It was such a late game. Do you think that had any effect on the game outcome whatsoever?
I don't know. Now you went to Dan Mullen's press conference. Did he address it? Because he was not high on this 8:20 kickoff start.
He did not address it, and I was waiting for someone to ask him that question, and I didn't want to ask him the question because, I didn't want to be that person that brought it up, brought up the bad blood that he was so angry about earlier, in the preseason. But I personally don't think that it had any effect on it. I think that these guys, when they're out there, adrenaline is rushing, and they're jacked up, and they're playing, and it's just all about what's going on in the moment, regardless of time and weather. And I think that the outcome just was what it was, and I think penalties overall just had the negative effect on LSU to not make it seem easier than it could have been for them. I think that they could have gotten the job done much easier without, the repercussions of penalties. But here we are, and we're following a W 21-19 here in Starkville versus Mississippi State. They face Auburn next weekend at home in Tiger Stadium. Catch our coverage all week on 104.5, 104.9 ESPN Radio Baton Rouge, and on our sister station, 98.1, the LSU Sports Radio Network. You can follow me on Twitter at Carley McCord. He's on Twitter at James Haralson for all your updates. Once again, live from Starkville, I'm Carley McCord. He's James Haralson. For 104.5, 104.9 ESPN Baton Rouge.